Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Ixalan spoilers. So today we got a couple of sweet things to talk about. A couple of new transform cards that look pretty exciting. Then some cool commons, uncommons, a new counter spell. So let's jump right into it. Starting off with one of the transform cards, Legion's Landing. So this card, only 1 mana, the cheapest of this cycle of enchantments that flip around into lands. When it enters the battlefield, you get a 1/1 white vampire creature with lifelink. Then if you attack with 3 or more creatures, you get to flip it around. So the front half, admittedly, is not very exciting. You get a trained Caracal. A 1/1 lifelink for 1 is not really something you, especially are building your deck around in Standard, just not big enough or relevant enough, not even really playable, although it's worth pointing out that it is a vampire, which is one of the supported tribes in Ixalan. We'll have to see. So far, we've only really seen Sanctum Seeker as a major vampire payoff, but maybe that will end up being relevant. The good news is, and what's going to make this card exciting, is the flip side. So what does Legion Landing flip around into? Adanto the First 4, which is super powerful. Adds white mana, can also pay 3 and tap it, and you end up with a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. So it's just a steady source of tokens for your vampire deck, for any deck. It's very strong. This is basically an updated version of Kajoran Outpost, which kind of did the same thing. It was a little bit cheaper to activate, but it had some big drawbacks. You had to sacrifice a plains when it entered the battlefield. So instead of having to sacrifice your own lands, you gotta pay a bit more for your token. The token also gets lifelink, which is nice. Another comparison for this would be Westville Abbey. Of course, you don't get the potential of flipping around and winning the game, but just being able to pay some amount of mana to make a token every turn. And the token from Adanto is even more powerful than Westville Abbey. Instead of paying life to make a token, with Adanto, you're actually getting a lifelink token, which makes it a great chump blocker, good for staying alive, stabilizing. So I think the flip side is super powerful, maybe even good enough to play the front half, which admittedly is not super exciting, but at least it's super cheap. I mean, in theory, you can 1-drop Legion's Landing on turn 1, turn 2, 2 more 1-drops, and flip it around and start making tokens right on turn 3, which is pretty nice. As far as seeing play in Standard, the place I'm most excited for the card is in some sort of tokeny, aristocraty style deck. Anointed Processions, Hidden Stockpiles, Bantu the Glorified. Having a cheap source of tokens is super nice there. Stuff to sacrifice to stockpile, double up with Anointed Procession. So I think it definitely could fit there because you don't even really mind making a 1/1 for 1 because you get a double up on it thanks to Anointed Procession. And in worst case, it's something that you can sacrifice. It comes down cheap. And then once you have Adanto, it's actually really powerful. The question for the card is, can it actually see playing a vampire deck? And if you're playing white aggro, this is just a really easy card to include because the flip half is so good. The thing about vampires is we haven't seen that many payoffs, and some of the payoffs that we have seen, like Maverick Fiend, don't actually want tokens. They make tokens, but you don't get vampires when your tokens from Adanto the First 4 attacks. I think that vampires might be the least supported of all the tribes, at least from the cards we've seen so far. So that's kind of a vote against Adanto as far as tribal in specific, but I still think that it can be very good just because the back half, the making a token with lifelink for 3 mana, is a super powerful payoff and definitely worth the 1 mana investment. We also got another really interesting transform card in Dowsing Dagger, and this is one of the most unique equipments we've seen in a long time. So 2 mana equipment gives your creature +2/+1. When the equipped creature deals damage, it transforms, and we'll talk about what it transforms into in a minute. The downside is, when it enters the battlefield, you got to give your opponent 2/0/2 defenders to block. So it takes some building around to make Dowsing Dagger work. It's kind of a Trusty Machete, just stat-wise. Trusty Machete, a little cheaper to cast, but the same +2/+1. Trusty Machete was very good in Limited, didn't really catch on too much in Constructed, but it's not a bad rate as far as being equipment, not considering the downside of giving your opponent the creatures. And then it's kind of an Elbrus the Blinding Blade type trigger, although that's kind of a bad comparison because Dowsing Dagger is way cheaper. That's the reason Elbrus wasn't really played. It was just way too much mana. So what does Dowsing Dagger flip around into? And the answer is, it's a Lotus Vale. It's Lost Vale, a land that taps for 3 mana of any color, a super incredibly powerful land. Kind of like Lotus Vale, exactly like Lotus Vale, except you don't have to sack your lands, which is nice. Kind of like a Gilded Lotus, a 5-mana artifact, but you're getting it on a land, which is super strong. So the payoff is really good. The weird thing about this card, though, is there's like this weird tension. So since you're giving your opponent these plants to chump block with, you really want to play Dowsing Dagger in some sort of aggressive, evasive type deck. Looking at like pirates, you have Kitesail Freebooter, you have Daring Saboteur, Slitherblade, not a pirate, but that's an easy curve. Slitherblade turn 1, Dowsing Dagger, equip on turn 3, get in, flip it around. The weird tension though is, what do you do with 3 mana in these decks? I mean, it's never bad. You can use it to activate your Daring Saboteur or whatever, but what's the big payoff? Like, you're working towards mid-range stretch. Usually in those type of decks, your top end is going to be 4 mana, 5 mana, so having this land that taps for a ton of mana isn't necessarily super helpful. On the other hand, Lost Vale would be absurd in a dinosaur deck, where you have these huge, super powerful things to ramp into. The question is, how do you actually get it flipped in a dinosaur deck, because you don't have the early evasive things like you do in Pirates, so there's this really weird tension. The good news about Dowsing Dagger / Lotus Vale, instant commander stable. This is super easy as long as you have creatures in your deck, a decent number of creatures. You just play this card because you're always going to use the mana. You have this nice political aspect where you're giving an opponent of your choice the 2/0/2s, so you can kind of use that. I mean, it's not a big reward, but maybe you can kind of garner some favor with one of your opponents by choosing them to get the plants. And then in the 4-player format, you just attack whoever doesn't have a good blocker, so it's much easier to flip in Commander. So I think Dowsing Dagger, definite all-star in Commander, staple in Commander. As far as Standard, I just don't know where it fits. I think it could be good enough because a land tapping for 3 mana is just way insanely above the curve. I just don't know exactly the home for it, so it's going to take a bit of work to figure out if and where it works in Standard, but definitely an all-star for Commander decks everywhere. Our last rare of the day is Spell Swindle. New 5-mana counter spell, and when you counter something with it, you get to make a bunch of treasure tokens, where that is the spell's converted mana cost. So this is sort of the treasure version of Confirmed Suspicions, which, I mean, is pretty good. You investigate 3 times with Confirmed Suspicion, so you get a bunch of clue tokens to sack. Spell Swindle obviously gives you mana instead of cards, but it's still pretty good. It's kind of like an updated version of Mana Drain, although I'm a bit suspicious of it because we had Plasm Capture, which is hard to cast. It is 2 colors, which makes it hard and so forth, and Spell Swindle does have the big advantage of being treasure tokens, so you don't have to use the mana right away. With Mana Drain and Plasm Capture, you counter something, you gotta use that mana in your next turn or you don't really get to do anything with it. But Plasm Capture never really caught on. It was like somewhat hyped when it was spoiled, and it just never worked out. So I think that Spell Swindle can be standard playable, but I think its ceiling is pretty much Confirmed Suspicions, which has been like a 1 of, maybe a 2 of max in Torrential Gearhulk targets. It's a nice counter spell to flashback with Torrential Gearhulk and counter something, makes you more mana to cast your removal and your finishers and so forth. So I think that's where Spell Swindle could show up. Not expecting it to be a 4 of counter spell, probably not even a 3 of counter spell, but it'll pop up here and there, I expect, alongside Torrential Gearhulk, because making a bunch of mana is nice. Control decks always want a ton of mana. You don't mind having extra mana in a control deck, so Spell Swindle can be a pretty good replacement for Confirmed Suspicions in that sense. Finally, we just have a bunch of commons and uncommons. First up, Legion Conquistador, which is basically the new vampire-y Squadron Hawk. Definitely worse than Squadron Hawk, I think. I'd rather have a 2-mana 1/1 flyer than a 3-mana 2/2 ground creature, but it is a good way to generate a bunch of card advantage in your vampire deck. Also, a soldier could be relevant in soldier decks too, if you're playing casually. But basically, when it enters the battlefield, you get to search for another copy of it. So over the course of the game, each copy keeps pulling up another copy. Could be relevant. I mean, it does maybe work with some of the sacrifice themed decks, maybe in a vampire deck, but the problem is a 2/2 for 3, even that draws you another copy of it, just isn't very powerful. The body is not big enough. It doesn't really do much of anything. So I don't know. I would be surprised if it really showed up, but it does have an outside shot. Squadron Hawk was very good back in the day. We also got Merfolk Branchwalker, which is one of my favorite new 2-drops from this entire set. When it enters the battlefield, you explore, which means you reveal the top card of your library. You can put that card in your hand if it's a land, so you can draw a card with it. Otherwise, you put a counter on your creature, and you sort of scry. You either put the card back or put it in your graveyard. So this is like a combination of the Elvish Visionary and Terrain Elemental with upside. So you either get an Elvish Visionary, drawing a land, and you get a 2/1, which is fine. A 2/1 2-drop that draws you a card is a very reasonable threat. I played plenty of Elvish Visionaries in the day. Or you get an even better card, potentially, as a 3/2 that lets you scry one, so you draw like half of a card. Plus you get a really on-curve 2-drop. A 3/2 for 2 is not a bad deal. I mean, Terrain Elemental hasn't really seen play, but it also doesn't have the upside of scrying away a card you don't want. So I think all around, Merfolk Branchwalker might not look like much, but I think this has the stats and the abilities to be standard playable. Maybe in a Merfolk deck if Green-Blue Merfolk catches on. Otherwise, it's just a reasonable value play. Like, 2-drops that draw you a card have a long history of being playable here and there, and I think Merfolk Branchwalker fits right into that curve and even has a better body than most of them. Finally, we got Bishop of the Bloodstained, another vampire, and this is a sweet vampire payoff for tokens. It's very reminiscent of Grey Merchant of Asphodel. So Grey Merchant drains your opponent a ton thanks to your devotion to black. Bishop of the Bloodstained doesn't actually gain you life, it just drains your opponent, but it doesn't equal to the number of vampires you control. So in theory, if you can get 20 vampires, you 20 your opponent when Bishop enters the battlefield. Works with Panharmonicon, works with Blink effects. I think this is almost a strictly worse version of Grey Merchant though. I think Grey Merchant just had a lot more flexibility. It didn't care about a creature type. All you needed to do was play black mana symbols, which meant you could play gods, you could play Night Veil Specters. There were tons of ways to get multiple black mana symbols on the battlefield with the card. Plus, the life gain was really nice. It stabilized you. And Bishop of the Bloodstained is kind of just like a watered-down, very narrow version of Grey Merchant. That said, it could still be a super sweet payoff for a vampire deck. I mean, a 5-mana 3/3 isn't exciting, but if it deals like 5-10 damage to your opponent, a good chance of that can just come down and close out the game in your vampire deck. Finally, we got Lurking Chupacabra, the very last card for the day, and this is just a sweet limited card, a sweet flavor card. Yeah, I mean, it's good if you're playing like a explory theme deck in limited, because you can shoot down your opponent's creatures whenever you explore. Very unlikely that a 2/3 for 4 is going to show up in standard, but it's still, I mean, it's a cool card. I'm glad it exists. It'll be fun and limited, but I think that's about as good as it gets for the Lurking Chupacabra. And those have been our Ixalan spoilers for today, so let me know what you think. How good is Legion's Landing? Can it work in a vampire deck, or is it just a general token value-y card? How about Dowsing Dagger? Is there a way to make that card work? What's the home for that? Do you have to be an aggressive, evasive deck? And what's the payoff if you are? Can you make it work in Dinosaurs somehow? Spell Swindle, is that going to see standard play, or is it just kind of a cool, flavorful counter spell? How about the commons and uncommons? Can Legion's Conquistador work? How about Merfolk Branchwalker? How good is that Bishop of the Bloodstained? Does that make you want to play vampires? Let me know in the comments. Again, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.